My name is Caleb Ferganchick. I use he, they pronouns interchangeably. I'm a poet. More specifically, I do slam poetry. People ask me all the time what slam poetry is, and I think I even struggle giving a definitive definition for it. I think historically slam poetry kind of developed out of the beat poetry scene, and it's a form of performance poetry that is traditionally has a competition element that really focuses on rhyme, rhythm, and repetition. But I also like to think of slam poetry as being intrinsically queer. But a lot of the poetry that I write for slams in particular kind of explores my identity as a rural queer person and kind of the systematic oppression that I've experienced in that regard, fighting against homophobia or the patriarchy or Americans' really unique brand of Christian evangelicalism and kind of how all of those things have influenced my identity and my resiliency in being able to come out of those things and still be authentic to myself. I think the most challenging aspect of writing is the practice of writing. I will get inspiration for a poem and just I can bust out a poem in 15 to 30 minutes and be happy with it. But if I am not, if there's not something that is giving me a burst of inspiration, I sometimes really struggle with just committing to that practice of writing and writing for the sake of writing and bettering my craft. And so I think carving out the time for myself to write just for the sake of writing and honing my own craft or working on the skills of writing can be really challenging, especially when you're used to writing in a way that gives such immediate affirmation from an audience. I absolutely struggle with writer's block. I think most of my work comes from moments of just spontaneous inspiration. And it's very rare that I can make myself sit down and come up with something that I'm going to write about. So it's definitely just working on being more present and letting things come to me, and then knowing when to write those things down. So my phone has all sorts of sticky notes with just one or two sentences that I will have no idea what I was thinking or what made me write that down. And sometimes those notes will sit there for years and they will never get touched again. But sometimes I'll notice something else and then remember that I had written something down on my phone, and it will kind of connect. And I build something from multiple observations that I had no idea would connect. But especially for marginalized people, I think art creates just whether that's visual or written modes that people can see themselves and also see themselves in others and solidify or create a sense of community or belonging that otherwise may not exist in a community that is pretty homogeneous, right? So art allows us to collect around a piece of art and talk about what that art means to our identities as individuals, but also as communities. And communities are very diverse and complex. Even marginalized communities, right, are not uniform. And so art allows us to find those commonalities, but also gives us a window through which to talk about those differences and create a more rich and diverse community. I hope my poetry does a mix of things. I think first and foremost, what's really important to me is that my poetry builds space for marginalized folks or people who share marginalized identities with me to feel seen, to feel like they exist in a space where they are heard or valued, where no matter what else is going on outside of that poetry presentation, they are still intrinsically valuable as a human being and that their story matters. I also hope that my poetry, I definitely also hope my poetry makes people uncomfortable. A lot of my poetry, especially my newer poetry, has been centered around the anger and rage that comes with being marginalized and how there is not an outlet for that anger or rage for marginalized people. And that when we express that anger and rage, it becomes then doubly weaponized against us, right? And so I lean into that anger and rage when I'm performing with the intent of hoping making people who do not experience discrimination or systemic oppression uncomfortable, to really sit with themselves and think about how much their apathy plays into that discrimination or systemic oppression. So yeah, a mix of creating comfort and space for healing, but also creating discomfort and kind of breaking people's assumptions down to build something else. Going back to the audience bit with slam poetry, that's sometimes the most rewarding aspect for me is, and not necessarily the audience's immediate reaction to my work, but especially when I was first starting with slam poetry, I spent a lot of time just writing pieces about struggling with mental illness, like major recurrent depression and chronic post-traumatic stress. And so, like, I would have all the time people would come up to me after poetry performances and just say, hey, that really resonated with me, or I'm struggling with this too. And I think that's really rewarding, to get to connect with people who are struggling with mental illness and struggling with the still present institutional stigmatization that we have around mental illness, where people don't feel comfortable talking about mental illness because it always becomes clinical, or it's like the end of the world if someone is depressed and we have to walk on eggshells. So I think, yeah, that kind of poetry allows me to kind of just break through and talk about the reality of living with mental illness, and then getting to talk with other people that are also experiencing it, who feel kind of empowered to share their own story or experience with mental illness. So I think especially related to mental illness, slam poetry has a unique way of creating space for people to talk about mental illness. So for the 4th annual Slamming Bricks this last year, we did an audience survey of people who just kind of witnessed the poetry slam. And 80% of people that were at the poetry slam were either attempt survivors themselves, had lost someone to suicide, or knew someone that survived an attempt. And that is that's a staggering number, right? We know that suicide and suicidality is a huge issue, but then to see that 80% of the people in a room that you were just with have a deeply personal connection to it was really, I think, eye-opening for me. But again, I think having poets on stage who are talking about mental illness in a really visceral and honest way, and kind of just saying, I'm done with the shame of living with this, and kind of giving voice to that, I think it allows people to just have those conversations and not feel the shame, or not feel like they need to repress it. Because again, I think even in the ways that we do try to address mental illness or suicidality, it's always through a clinical gaze, or we're always trying to say, we need to heal this person, or we need to prevent their thoughts of suicidality, instead of saying, hey, maybe we just need a space where people can talk about this, and that's all, right? We just need the ability to share what we're going through and not feel so alone. And so I think, yeah, slam poetry is a really good avenue for that, and not just suicidality, but all things that people go through that they don't feel like they can talk about because of a sense of shame. There's not an established slam poetry scene here. I know a bunch of people who do slam poetry or are interested in slam poetry, but it's not we have a monthly or a weekly or even a quarterly slam poetry reading thing that other cities do, where artists kind of come together to host traditional poetry slams. And so it's been really cool to meet people that are interested in poetry, and particularly slam poetry, and getting to talk to them about the ways that I have found spaces to do slam poetry, but also consider that maybe it is worthwhile putting in some effort and energy into creating something more consistent for slam poetry. I think another really cool aspect that even just exists outside of the traditional art form is, early on in the residency, I utilized the space to help prepare for Slamming Bricks, which is a big LGBTQ poetry slam competition that I host here in Grand Junction. And we handmade all of the trophies in the studio space. So we had sculptors and painters, and poets, and even people who were not artistically inclined, who just wanted to be a part of creating Slamming Bricks, who were all hanging out and talking and painting these trophies or sculpting the little pieces for the trophies. And so again, kind of creating that sense of space or community for folks, through a slam poetry event, but actually in that moment had nothing to do with slam poetry or the written word. I don't know if it's just growing up queer in a rural town. I think everyone deals with it to some degree, but I've definitely always felt a sense of like imposter syndrome with my work, right? Like I said, it's not like I have a degree in creative writing or formal training in poetry, so calling myself a poet always feels weird, or like I don't have the right to do that, even though I do have published work, and I do host like one of the largest regional poetry slams for queer people. I still really struggle with giving myself the validation of being a poet. And so I think, like first and foremost, the residency kind of helped me see myself in that light, or as a legitimate poet. I think it helped me think about poetry more in terms of like creating community or creating space, and the way that we can create more poetry-centered or slam poetry events within the community. And I think like it gave me the space to really think about what I want to do next with my poetry, because like I said, I've spent so much time with my poetry like delving into my trauma, or like kind of addressing my mental illness, or like using it as a place to express my anger and rage. And what I found is that like I have kind of linked my validation as a poet, right, to my mental illness or my anger, because that's where I get like the audience's like approval or feedback, or those are the things that have gotten me like published, or those are the things that have like made me win poetry slams. And so I think I've come to view my value as a poet as intrinsically linked to being depressed or being an angry gay person. And I think like I will always probably struggle with depression, and I will always probably be an angry queer, but I don't know that I always want that to be like what my art is. And so I think that kind of quiet, reflective space of the studio has allowed me to start thinking about what else do I want to do with my craft? Like, how can I talk about queer joy or all the other elements of my life that are intrinsically queer, that are more than just those negative things that I've had to overcome. Ever since I've been doing slam poetry, but particularly like in the residency, people tell me all the time, like, I wish like I could write a poem, or I want to write a poem. And I think my response to that is like, just do it. There is like a plethora of poetry that I do not show to anyone or read anywhere. Even poems that I have published or like performed on stage, I look back sometimes and kind of cringe, or I'm like, I can't believe you had the audacity to like read that in front of people. And so I think like performing poetry, there is an element of like, yeah, just humility to it, and like getting to see yourself grow in that way. So if you're interested in writing a poem or performing, I think just do it, which is easier said than done. But yeah, in the same way that I hope that like the discomfort that I generate from reading poetry like elicits growth, I think like I grow as a person by leaning into my own discomfort about talking about things on stage. And so yeah, just anyone that has an inclination to do that, I think should absolutely do so.